And welcome back. My name is Nolan McCarty, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Politics and SPIA, as well as a member of the Executive Committee of the Julius Rabinowitz Center. Usually the task of a moderator for one of these sections is to say a few words to hook the audience on the importance of the topic, but I hardly need to do that today. Even without the lead up from Jay's excellent keynote, the importance of misinformation, distrust, partisanship, and polarization for the current crisis of democratic governance is pretty self-evident. Just this morning, I learned a very nice fact, however, that will help motivate it. It turns out, based on a recent survey, about 1/3 of the American public would prefer that the United States be broken up into a set of regional countries: the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, and the Pacific. Interestingly, the responses didn't vary much by region. In fact, the Northeast and the Pacific residents wanted a new country more than the Southerners did. But almost in every case, the majority party of the region supported a regional breakup much more than the minority party. So Republicans in the South want a new country, but Democrats in the Pacific Northwest want a new country just as much. So we really have become a situation where it is party before country, kind of reflecting some of the themes in Jay's talk. And so what we'd like to do in the next hour is to put our very great panel to good use and help us to understand these problems and to think a little bit about what can be done. So what I'd like to do now is just simply introduce the panelists. I'll introduce all of them now, and they can just go in order. They'll speak for about 10 minutes apiece, and then following that, we'll have about 25 minutes for question and answer. If people can just simply use the question and answer box on the Zoom in order to ask the questions, and then I'll moderate. So leading off, we'll have Yphtach Lelkes, who is an associate professor at the Annenberg School. I understand that's a new promotion, so congratulations, Yp. So he's in the School of Communications as well as the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His focus is on the role of political information environment in structuring attitudes, and has a special interest in the proliferation of digital media. He received his PhD from Stanford University, as well as a master's from Temple University, and a bachelor's in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Following If will be Liliana Mason, and I'm obliged to say Princeton class of 2000. So welcome back. Lily is Associate Professor of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park, and author of the excellent book, Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity. She received her PhD in political psychology from Stony Brook University. Her research concerns partisan identity, partisan bias, social sorting, and American social polarization. And then our third speaker will be Sander van der Linden, who is Professor of Social Psychology and Society and the Director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. He's won numerous awards for research on human judgment, communication, and decision-making. He has been described by Wired Magazine as one of the top 15 thinkers, and by Fast Company Design as one of 4 heroes who are defending digital democracy online. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Environmental Psychology and the book Risk and Uncertainty in a Post-Truth Society. Before joining Cambridge, he held academic positions at Princeton, Yale, and the London School of Economics. He received his PhD from the London School of Economics. With that, let me just turn it over to our first speaker, If.
Hello, is that okay, the sound? Great. All right, well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. In a snowy day like this, it's kind of useful. It's in New Jersey, at least, or Philadelphia. It's where I am. It's useful that this is online So today I want to talk about two things. One is a bit of a positive spin, I think, on the state of affairs, and the other is to, in reverse order, give an update on trends in effective polarization. And effective polarization is a topic that I've been working on for about 10 years now or so. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll give you a kind of a skeptical take on the idea of negative partisanship, which I think is thought of as the common wisdom that everything is driven by hatred rather than kind of in-group loyalty. So let me start with effective polarization. So perhaps the most cited finding from this work that I've done, this is work with Shantoi Iyengar and Gaurav Sood, comes from this inter-party marriage question. And this is data from 1960, which was collected by two political scientists, Ullman and Verba, who asked respondents whether they would be displeased with the prospect of their child marrying someone from the other party. So in 1960, less than 5% of Democrats and about 5% of Republicans said they would be displeased. So we updated this number in 2010 and found that this percentage has increased 9 to 10-fold. More than 30% of Democrats and almost 50% of Republicans said that they would be unhappy about their kid marrying someone from the other side. Another measure that is frequently used in this literature uses a survey instrument called a feeling thermometer, where survey respondents are asked to rate how cool or warm they feel towards various groups. And this is a plot from our 2019 paper that looked at feeling thermometer scores for how people felt about their party, how people felt about the other party, and the difference between the two, which we called effective polarization. So you see here in the green line that it's been pretty stable since the late 70s in how people feel towards their party. And feelings towards the out party have dropped pretty precipitously to in about half in the past 40 years, and then the difference is effective polarization. So one thing that we noticed, Sean Westwood and I, and maybe I'm sure others as well, is that between 2012 and 2016, effective polarization did not increase. In fact, it went down. And we were surprised by this, and it was going to be a big part of what I was going to talk about today. So this is the distribution of effective polarization. So again, feelings towards your party minus feeling towards the out party. This is the distribution. The light gray is 2016, and the dark gray is 2012. You see that they almost match immediately. So I was going to talk about that, and I was going to talk about how, because the 2016 election was so vitriolic, that claims that polarization was a result of vitriolic media and information might be exaggerated. And so that was going to be what I was going to talk about. But then last week, the American National Election Study, which is where most of this data, where all this data comes from, came out, and they released their 2020 data. And what you see is between 2016 and 2020, the biggest jump in effective polarization that we have in this 40-year time span. So effective polarization has certainly increased, as you probably are aware. You might not have needed data to tell you that. So those are updated trends on this. Now I want to talk about one, I would call it corollary of effective polarization, which is negative partisanship, which is the notion that this drive in animosity is driven by hatred, hatred of the other side. And this has become a bit of a truism, certainly in political science, and I think in the media as well. So here's some recent headlines. This is from CNN, Why Negative Partisanship Explains So Many of Americans' Political Problems. This is from Politico, Negative Partisanship Explains Everything. This is from 538, and this is from Yasha Monk in The Atlantic. And he writes, what is corroding American politics is specifically negative partisanship. Although most liberals feel conflicted about the Democratic Party, they really hate the Republican Party. And even though most conservatives feel conflicted about the Republican Party, they really hate the Democratic Party. So this is common wisdom, I think. And I've been somewhat skeptical of this for a couple of reasons, but I think the main reason is that social psych, for at least 50 years now, has claimed that in-group attachment is really the primary driver of behavior and is ultimately more important than out-group hate. And while I don't doubt that there is hate and there's been an increase in hate, my own work seems to indicate that hatred is second, and fealty or in-group love is actually primary or dominant. And this is just a quote from Hodgefeld and Turner, who really pushed the idea of social identities as being integral to one's identity. So as a first test of this idea, take this survey question, which we fielded in the Cooperative Congressional Election Study in 2016. And we asked respondents, sometimes we identify, so they were asked about their party identification. Do you identify as a Democrat or Republican? And then they were told, sometimes we define our identities in terms of the groups we belong to, and other times by the groups that we do not belong to. When it comes to political parties, would you say your political affiliation is based more on belonging to your own group or not belonging to the other party? So there's a missing sentence here, but it goes basically what we would call an affirmational identity, where someone is identifying with their party because it is based on identifying with it, to a negational identity, which is I identify with this group because I really dislike the other group. So when we just look at this distribution, we see that there are a lot of people who say equally based on identifying with my own party and not identifying with the other party. But the plurality of people are over here with this affirmational identity, where they identify with their party for the party and not against the other party. Very few people are over here where they strongly identify based on not identifying with the other party. Another way to look at this is by breaking it up into strength of party ID. And so we often ask people in political science whether they think of themselves as a strong partisan or a weak partisan, or whether they only lean towards one side if they identify as a Democrat. And we rescaled this affirmational identity variable from -2, which indicates that they really dislike or they don't identify with their party, to affirmational, that they identify with their party. And so here on the left is among leaners and the right is strong partisans. You see that the people who are really driving partisans, who are involved and active in politics, strong partisans, are overwhelmingly affirmational in their identity, not negational. The only negative partisans are those who are partisan leaners. Here's another way of looking at it. This is a common measure of negative partisanship, which is basically you take 100 minus feelings towards your own side minus feelings towards the other side. And this tells you, if scores are higher, that you dislike the other side more than you like your own side. And here in this plot, you would see on the x-axis the year, the y is negative partisanship is higher and positive partisanship is lower. And what you see again is that there has certainly been an increase in negative partisanship. However, the line has never crossed 0. So we're still in this era of positive partisanship where people feel more positive towards their side than negative about the other side. Now, real quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but I'll give you one more example of this. So in this experiment that we ran, this was a nationally representative sample, people read about a protest, and the protesters were either young Democrats or young Republicans. And it was randomly assigned whether the story was about young Democrats or young Republicans. And in the story, they were told that police used force and pepper sprayed them. Then they were asked, respondents after they read this were asked, how much should these protesters be fined? So here are those results. And on the y-axis is the amount people thought that protesters should be fined. And on the x-axis is effective polarization, so difference in feeling thermometer scores. And the right panel is for people who read, or excuse me, the left panel is for people who read about co-partisans. The right panel is about opposing partisans. And if the negative partisanship idea was correct, we'd expect fine amounts to go up as effective polarization goes up on this panel here. People want to inflict costs on the out party. They want to hurt them. However, if the positive partisanship theory was correct, we'd expect that fine amounts would go down as in this panel, as effective partisanship goes up, because people want to help out their own side. And this is exactly what we see. As effective partisanship goes up, the amount people want to fine co-partisans go down, but effective polarization is not at all related to how much they want to hurt the other side. So in sum, things are not great, without a doubt. Country is on the verge of being split up, and effective polarization has increased to new levels. But I do see some, I guess, a positive view of this to a certain extent, is that in-group favoritism is still dominant, and politics is ultimately still about wanting to help your side and not hurt the other side. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Lily.
Okay. Hi, thank you for having me. This is, I'm going to show you some data from a book that I'm working on with Nathan Kalmo right now, looking at actual violence that can be motivated by partisanship. So these are just a few things that were on the internet over the summer, warning about the possibility of violence, sort of rise of right-wing terrorist groups and hate groups, and these warnings that we should expect to see a lot more political violence in the U.S. around the election, coming from just relatively moderate think tanks. And then, of course, we all remember what happened on January 6th, which seemed like this kind of culmination of all of these stories that had been coming out about how we should expect to see some sort of violence. And so this project actually started in 2016 when Nathan and I started wondering about the sort of how far partisanship can go. We tend to think of it as a sort of benign type of thing, but we started wondering whether partisanship could drive some radical and potentially even dangerous behavior. So we came up with these scales. We call the first one moral disengagement. That's thinking the other party is a serious threat to the United States. Our slide is full screen. Am I not on full screen?
No. Yeah, you're showing your notes.
I'm showing my notes.
Well, you're not in presenter view.
Oh, I see. It's paused. Hold on. Sorry about that. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so we created these scales and we started measuring these in national samples in the US, actually starting in 2017. So throughout the Trump administration and sort of multiple repeated surveys. So we created this sort of first concept of moral disengagement, where people believe that the other party is a serious threat. People think that the other party is downright evil, and they dehumanize members of the other party. They're not, they lack the traits to be considered fully human. The second scale is what we're calling political violence, and that is support for things like sending threatening messages to political leaders, threatening and harassing someone on the internet in a way that makes them feel frightened, and actually just how justified is it for your own party to use violence in advancing political goals these days? And then what if your party loses the 2020 presidential election? So I'm going to show you these trends that we've seen, and this includes data that's hot off the presses. We literally got it yesterday from a YouGov study. These are all YouGov samples. So for moral disengagement, what we've been seeing is around 60-ish% of Americans agree that the other party is a serious threat to the United States and its people. About 40 to 50% believe that the partisans from the other group are evil, and between 20 and 30% believe that the outgroup partisans are like animals. The violence numbers are thankfully much lower, but and still, in general, we see that when we make people think about losing an election, they tend to support violence more. And then all of a sudden, this most recent data, we see a really large jump in all of these sort of pro-violent attitudes. And a lot of this, I have to say, the entire series from 2017 until now, pretty much Democrats and Republicans have similar levels of these attitudes. But after the elections, in this new February data, the Republicans are significantly more approving of violence than Democrats. And we assume that's just because of the outcome of the election. So these are concerning trends. We wanted to figure out what drives these attitudes. And we found basically two things are consistent drivers. The first is just trait aggression. So just you're an aggressive person. You say that, I've hit someone before. I get angry really easily. Unrelated to politics, just being an aggressive person. But the very consistent other predictor is your social identification with your party. So people who say things like, when I talk about my party, I say we rather than they. So thinking of your party as a social identity, feeling strongly connected to it, that sort of positive connection that Yphtach was talking about, that is a strong predictor of both partisan violence, or a significant predictor of both partisan violence and moral disengagement, even when controlling for trait aggression. So we wanted to also see the relationship between these sort of deep rifts in our society, like racism and sexism, and see whether that had any effect on these types of attitudes, because they seem to be underlying a lot of our partisan divide lately. So this is the classic racial resentment scale. It should be familiar to most political scientists, but this is a common scale that we use to measure racial resentment against Black Americans in particular. So we asked people these questions, and then we looked by party whether the levels of racial resentment had any effect on moral disengagement. And what we found is that among Republicans, it has a very large and significant effect on feeling morally disengaged from Democrats. So Republicans who are very high in racial resentment, they're much more likely to think that Democrats are evil, are a threat to the country, and are not human. For Democrats, that's not the case, and there's almost a negative relationship here, presumably because the base levels of racial resentment for the two parties are very different. The average score for Democrats is 0.3 on a 0 to 1 scale, and for Republicans is 0.7. So effectively, for Democrats that are high in racial resentment, they feel some sympathy for Republicans because it's a point of connection for them. So they don't morally disengage from Republicans. We also looked at this for sexism. We used the hostile sexism scale, which again we didn't make it up. It's coming from other literature, including these 3 items. Most women interpret innocent remarks or acts as being sexist, etc. And again, we find the same thing. So among Republicans, those who are score the highest in hostile sexism are much more likely to think about Democrats as evil and threats to the United States and not human, versus those who are very low in hostile sexism. But for Democrats, there's just simply no effect. And so in particular, what we want to think about, sort of going forward is, so first of all, we know that partisanship is driving a lot of these attitudes, but also we know that within the Republican Party, partisanship is working together with racial resentment and hostile sexism to make these attitudes even worse. So that's something that we should just be keeping our eyes on for the future. The good news is that it matters what our leaders say. So we ran an experiment where we had people read a quote. This is a real quote from Joe Biden. That's just an anti-violence quote. Violence directed at anyone because their political opinions is never acceptable. And among the people who read this, so some people read this and some people in the control condition read nothing. So for the people who read nothing, this is the gray line is the people who read nothing. We see the familiar pattern. Stronger partisans are generally more pro-political violence. But this effect completely reverses when they read this anti-violence message from a leader, presumably because strong partisans are sort of naturally going to be more willing to engage in violence because they want to protect their group, but they're also going to be more likely to listen to their leaders because they're loyal to their group. And so as people are more strongly identified with their party, the less they approve of political violence when they hear this message from Joe Biden. Now, we also used a message from Donald Trump. It didn't work. It didn't work as well. We think largely because it wasn't really consistent with what he normally says, and so people just didn't buy it. But so this is a promising way to try to address this. So just to sort of sum up, basically worrisome things. More than 1 in 5 Americans seem to approve of political violence. That number has increased since the election. 40 to 50% of Americans think the other party is evil, right? We have created this ethical and moral distance between ourselves and our partisan opponents. And this is driven by strong partisanship. People who feel really strongly affiliated with their party are much more likely to hold these vilifying and basically anti-democratic attitudes. And for Republicans, it's worse for those who are high in racial resentment and hostile sexism. But the most important thing to take away, I think, from this is that while these are all very worrying phenomena, we know that our leaders can change people's attitudes towards these things. And so to the degree that we can encourage our leaders and even our media to discourage violence and discourage this type of dehumanization, we should be encouraging them to do that. So I will stop there and hand it over.
Great, terrific. Okay, Sandra, it's all yours.
All right, let me see. My PowerPoint is not showing up here. Let me try that again. Can people see this?
Yes, but you're not in. Okay, now perfect. Now
is this good?
Yes, perfect.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. It reminds me of my Princeton days where I was a postdoc, and Eldar was actually a great inspiration to me while I was there. All of what I'm about to say is going to be part of a forthcoming book, The Truth Vaccine, an Antidote to Fake News and Misinformation. I just want to talk a little about what we can do to try to combat misinformation, political misinformation, and including polarization. And I won't spend a whole long time on definitions, but people use the term fake news. I'm just using it here. Particularly of interest to me is disinformation and political propaganda, so the intentional spread of false information. And one of the things that we've learned in cognitive science, which is really important, is that the traditional way of addressing misinformation, Jay talked about legislation and other tools, but if we don't want to restrict people's freedom using those tools, we could try to empower people at the individual level. But debunking and fact-checking can work, but a lot of research shows that once people are exposed to a falsehood, once they're exposed to misinformation, it continues to stick in memory, and people continue to retrieve information from memory and make inferences based on false information, even when they acknowledge a correction. So there's a drawback to trying to do things after the fact. We can think of it as a spectrum. And what I want to talk about is our approach to the idea of pre-bunking or inoculation, trying to prevent misinformation from sticking in the first place, to kind of real-time fact-checking and ultimately debunking after the fact. And there's a place for all of these tools, but we've sort of been looking at this idea of vaccinating people, and it has a fascinating history. Social psychologist Bill McGuire came up with inoculation theory in the 60s when he was trying to study how to prevent people from being persuaded. There's so much stuff on wanting to persuade people, but not a whole lot of work on how to help people resist persuasion when we don't want it. Unfortunately, he kind of dropped this theory and it faded from the history of social psychology after the 70s, and he never actually tested it in the context of misinformation. So it seemed like a great opportunity to do that now. I'll briefly walk you through the idea of the metaphor. Just as injecting people with a weakened dose of a vaccine triggers the production of antibodies to help confer resistance to future infection, turns out you can do the same with misinformation. When you expose people to a severely weakened dose of misinformation, you forewarn people that they're about to be attacked, they're more likely to produce intellectual or cognitive antibodies against the misinformation, and people build resistance over time. So there's this threat element where you warn people in advance, but also a cognitive basis, and this is called the reputational preemption, or you preemptively refute the content that people are about to see, and we call that a pre-bunk. If you want to read in detail, there's a great PNES feature on our journey of finding a vaccine against misinformation. We've done some lab experiments that I don't want to talk about here in the context of climate change and really doing stuff specifically highly controlled. What I want to talk about now is kind of what we did to then go and work with governments and social media companies to actually implement this on a global sort of scale. The media kind of described it as a fake news vaccine, which was a little bit of an exaggeration in the sense that the inoculation metaphor in a psychological sense doesn't give you full immunity. One journalist called us and asked if this was fake news. Obviously, they hadn't played our intervention before. But what I want to get to is a quote from Professor Snape from the Harry Potter novels, who said, your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. And when it comes to the evolving nature of misinformation and divisiveness in society, I think he's absolutely right. We need new tools. And that led us to go outside of the lab, partner with an organization, and produce an intervention that we call Bad News. Bad News is a pun, it's a game. It's a cognitive simulation engine where people can play around, and we forewarn them of the dangers of fake news, and we expose them to weakened doses of the strategies that underlie the production of most fake news. And through that experiential element, people gain resistance to fake news over time. So how does it work? You step into the engine, it simulates a social media feed. So it's much more realistic than what we can do in surveys generally. So you have a follower meter and a credibility meter, and your goal is to gain as many followers while not losing any credibility. You start out impersonating Donald J. Trump. After long deliberation with my general, decided to declare war on North Korea, hashtag Kim Jong-un. We have changed this now since Trump is no longer president. Now it's Biden who tweets out annexing Canada, hashtag North Dakota. And so basically what happens here is that you step into the shoes of somebody who's trying to deceive you. What better way is there to inoculate yourself than to walk a mile in the shoes of somebody who's trying to deceive you? Now, Trump is misspelled here, the Twitter handle, if you may have noticed. This is part of our impersonation badge. You start tweeting out stuff, the mainstream media is a conspiracy, you create your own hashtags, you're trending, you're creating echo chambers, people respond, it's very interactive. And we go through 6 techniques that we've detailed after years of studying of what are the factors that underlie the spread of most misinformation. So polarization is a big factor, also impersonating other people, the spread of conspiracies, trolling, the use of emotions to manipulate people, fear-mongering, and discrediting. I want to focus particularly on polarization just for the sake of this talk, but I'll give you an example of how we implement this in the game. Once people progress through a level, they earn a badge, they master a technique, and then they progress to the next level. It's fictional content in the game, so we don't actually dupe people, but it's based on reality. So, there was a fake guy on Twitter pretending to be Warren Buffett, used the same technique, a tiny change in the Twitter handle. They got hundreds of thousands of followers, and this account was tweeting out random nonsense, invest in what makes you happy. Lots of people were duped. So we use the same techniques to try to educate people. And here's how our polarization module looks like, so you get a feel of what it's like. So you come across Jolene, who says, whoa, just saw the police arrest a guy, scary stuff, hashtag are we safe? And you can then attack this story and say, well, let's exploit this. What would a misinformation sort of expert do? We want to talk about police brutality or rising crime rates. And then you pick a story. I'm going with the traditional left-wing angle here. But we tell the user, look, it doesn't matter if you had chosen the right-wing angle. Their goal is to demonize the other group as much as possible. That's how you recognize polarizing content online. You start floating memes. Police told them to eat broccoli. You refused. You start stirring up political debate, right? The police force always chasing the bad guys, and so on. And so you really get people to be divisive. People respond, oh, Jolene's right. The police force is to blame. Hashtag free Jolene. Joe Bot is so right. We have to stop the lunatics from hijacking our society. Things get out of control. And then in the game, we actually test people, right? So we expose people to content they haven't seen before in the game. And we ask them how reliable they find it. So here's an example of what we call a polarizing tweet, the myth of equal IQ exposed between left and right-wing people. People rate how reliable they find it pre and post our intervention. At first, we launched this online. It was voluntary. People just come to the website. Lots of people played it. So this was an opt-in within subjects experiment. We had about 30,000 data points. So we had about 15,000 people. What we find broadly is that on real news, real items, people don't change. They find this highly credible. But on the items that we show people that use the techniques that they've learned about, they've become significantly, find those significantly less reliable for each of the techniques, including polarization. It didn't really matter if you were young, old, left, or right wing. There are some small differences in people's susceptibility to misinformation consistent with the literature, but for the intervention effect, there weren't huge differences. We decided to do a randomized experiment. This was published in the Journal of Cognition. By the way, everything's on the OSF, all our items, surveys, data sets, R scripts, if you want to have a go. Good news about bad news. Here we look at whether the game also boosts people's confidence. If you're not very confident in what you believe, you're easily persuaded. So we're looking to see now if we can not only replicate this effect with a control group who played Tetris for the same amount of time, kind of a neutral game. We find that, again, people find the average of lots of misinformation items less reliable after playing the game, but they also become more confident in their truth discernment abilities after playing the game. And this includes, 10, 20 items that include our techniques. So we decided to replicate this research again, but we got lots of questions from the media saying, oh, this is cool, but how long does the vaccine last? If you inoculate people like this, does it decay over time? Which is a great question. So we dove back into the research. We exposed people to similar headlines. This is a fake organization that says, oh, solution to greenhouse gas uncovered years ago. Scientists were silenced. This is part of the conspiracy badge. And so we're hoping people recognize now that this is meant to be conspiratorial. This is a three-part study we published in the Journal of Experimental Psych recently. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I just want to give you the baseline idea. All of the experiments were the same. People do a pretest. We quiz them on a bunch of fake news items. They're randomized to treatment control. We test them again, and then we follow up with them without giving them the intervention again 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 2 months later, and so on. In the second experiment, we didn't have intermediate testing. We just followed up at the end. In the third experiment, we started to switch the items around so that we could exclude item memorization as a possible compound. Basically, what we found is that in the pretest, not much happens. After people play the game, significant drop in how reliable people find fake news, and that stayed stable week after week after week after week, which is really surprising. So we decided to discontinue this repeated testing and just look what happens at the end. And what we found is that there is decay. It's still significantly different between control and inoculation, but when you don't test people in between, there is the vaccine wanes over time. And so we're now starting to think that when you prod people in between, it's kind of a booster shot, just as you have to go back to the doctor sometimes, priming people with the dangers of fake news in between by testing them might actually serve as some kind of booster. We've decided to go and work with the government here to implement this. The government translated our intervention in every major language in the world, which allowed us to do large-scale cross-cultural testing. We've had about 1 million people go through this intervention. We found that pretty much the same result in different cultures. People find fake news less reliable. There's some heterogeneity across cultures, but I'm happy to chat about that more. We've just launched Go Viral, which is on COVID-19 specifically with the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the UK government. So you can play this one for free online. Again, everything's free. It's for people to use and play. I don't want to talk about the COVID-19 one because I want to talk about the one we did with the U.S. government. I should mention John Rosenbeek. He's our postdoc. He drives a lot of this work. Absolute credit to him. He's with Cass here at the United Nations doing some pre-bunking. And what we did with the Department of Homeland Security in the US was we launched Harmony Square during the US election to try to pre-bunk political misinformation. Harmony Square is focused exclusively on political misinformation. It uses a pineapple metaphor that the Department of Homeland Security uses to try to explain foreign influence, which is, you start a debate about whether or not to put pineapple on pizza, people get divided on the issue, they start attacking each other on social media, and so it expands. And that's kind of what we show people in the game. And basically what happens is that there is a candidate who's running for election, it's Plug, and you're running a disinformation campaign on Plug. I think Plug's animal abuse is unbearable. There's an actual newscaster here who has real-time ratings, approval ratings, and the more misinformation you spread, and the more you attack people, the lower the rating, so you can see the consequences of people's actions. Again, all weakened doses do not actually dupe people. A clever journalist here summed it up saying, you start in this idyllic American town, the last democracy on earth, and then you start to wreak havoc and things evolve from there. So we recently published these results in the Harvard Misinformation Review. Here's some of the test items. We started to use actual items now that are found in the news that are less controlled. Fathers don't deserve a day, and Father's Day. There was an incident on South Carolina where somebody replied 1.5 less MAGA in the world, MAGA billies in the world. At least they died supporting their beloved Second Amendment. This is the classic sort of polarizing content people are exposed to on social media. So these are kind of the test items we use. After playing the intervention, again, these are pre-post difference scores separated out by condition. People find this less reliable on average across these many items. They're more confident in their ability to spot it, and they're less likely to report, to want to share it in their social network. So I'll end it there. I just want to say that the cognitive vaccine idea is nice, but ultimately where we want to go is herd immunity. So we want to implement this on the widest scale possible, because if enough people are vaccinated, polarization won't have a chance to spread as far and as wide as it currently does. Thanks for your attention.
Great, thank you. This all three very terrific presentation. I think to kick off the question, I want to ask a fairly broad question that any of the three of you might want to take a crack at. I think one of the things that I always puzzle over is why now? It seems like misinformation, conspiratorial levels of mistrust have been an endemic part of politics for a very long time. The historian Richard Hofstadter wrote a book in the 1950s about the history of the paranoid style in American politics. So there was enough going on in 1950 to write a whole history about it. So I wonder if any of you could speak to the question of why now? Is it actually worse now than before? And if so, is it, I think there are really two hypotheses. One is a technological one. It's the virility of social media, cable news, et cetera. So it's a technological response. Bad information, polarizing speech and information can just disseminate more quickly. Or is it a receptivity one? Is there something in the kind of political, social cultures or the economic situation which makes people more receptive to these messages? So which is it, or is it both?
I guess I can start. I'll also talk about I might also be answering for Lily, since I'll talk about her work as well, so she can correct me. But Pearson and Schickler, two political scientists, talk about these kind of reinforcement mechanisms that are occurring these days, or these meso-level institutions that are really ramping up the volume on everything. So that I would play these meso-level things like technology, these interest group stuff, really turning up the volume on everything, starting 30 years ago or so is one reason. And the other, which is, I should just let Lily speak, is that there's been kind of a decline in cross-cutting identities And maybe I'll just let Lily talk about that.
Yeah, Lily.
Yeah. Right. So my quick answer to you is probably that it's both media and what our partisan identities, because I'll let Sandra talk about the media, but what's been happening with our partisan identities is that they've become more attached to our racial and religious and other cultural and geographical identities, which means that whenever there's an election, the threat of losing the election feels worse because it's attacking not just the status of your party, but the status of all of these other identities that are now associated with the party. And increasingly what we're seeing in the US is that the divide between Democrats and Republicans is really over the traditional social hierarchy, right? With Democrats essentially saying, we want more egalitarian, multiracial democracy, and Republicans basically saying, we've had enough progress. We don't need to make any more progress in this direction. And that's a very deep and divisive debate that we've never peacefully had as a nation about, racial equality has never been a peaceful conversation, and it's increasingly central to the party divide. So I think on the sort of identity-based side, it's a factor of these partisan identities becoming kind of organized around some of our deepest and most violent debates that we've ever had as a nation.
Sandra?
Yeah, I'll quickly add, you mentioned the paranoid style. We recently published a paper called The Paranoid Style Revisited with our colleague John Jost. And one of the things we found in 3 national samples was actually that if you look at basic conspiracy cognition, so people's belief in conspiracies, but trying to disentangle that from politics. And one of the ways you have to do that is to not ask people if they believe in conspiracy theories that are very specific and partisan, but to just ask items that tap into a general sense of conspiratorial thinking. Do you think people are following you? And do you think the government is up to nefarious things? And what we found was a clear asymmetry in that very basic cognition that replicated throughout. But the important thing is not that necessarily that liberals and conservatives are different. In this case, it was that conservatives scored higher on conspiracy cognition than liberals. But I think the more interesting finding actually was that it's fully mediated by an enhanced sense of distrust and paranoia. So we also had a paranoid ideation scale and a distrust of official authority scale. And I think the fact that it's mediated by this growing sense of distrust and paranoia was really interesting. And that includes the media and skepticism about the media. I think a popular topic of debate is whether there's more conspiracies now than ever before. And it's kind of contested. Joseph Basinski has some interesting thoughts on that, saying that, it's not the case that we have more conspiracies. In fact, my answer is usually, look at World War II. There were massive propaganda campaigns. There were massive conspiracies during World War II. Divisions were intense. It's not necessarily the case, I think, that we see more of it, but social media is able to leverage and amplify some of these sentiments in unprecedented ways, and I think in ways we don't fully understand. Some of the WhatsApp lynchings that happened in India are not only because of WhatsApp, not only because they're allowed to spread so widely and so fast, but also because there were deep cultural divisions within their country that were happening before WhatsApp came. So I think it's this interaction between politics, identity, and social media.
Great, thanks. Okay, a second question that I think is broad enough that any of you might answer is that it's someone from the question and answer asked about more parties. We've talked mostly about the United States, which has 2 parties, which makes it easy to define in-group and out-group identities. What's the evidence in other party systems or other countries that have multi-party systems? Does that tend to reduce affective polarization? Produce a more healthy democratic dynamic, or does it make much difference?
I was sorry to jump in again. I'll talk about it only because we're running an experiment as we speak on this. So the evidence is there is a group of researchers that show that countries with PR systems for proportional representation have lower levels of effective polarization. And the notion there, and so there's kind of 2 parts to that. One is that that there's less of it, and I think this was one of the questions, there's less of a zero-sum game in PR systems, that there's an incentive to cooperate with another group. And so effective polarization is especially low towards out parties who are part of your coalition. Another aspect of this is, that I think is pretty important, is this winner-loser gap in effective polarization, where people who lose an election in majoritarian systems are saltier, they're madder because they lost it all, while those who lost in a PR system are more likely to cooperate and to compromise and to be part of a coalition. And as Leipart said, that PR systems are made for kinder, gentler politics. And you see that with observational data. What we're doing in the lab now is kind of putting people in somewhat stylized games where they play under different electoral rules. And we're seeing, at least in pilot data, between winners and losers.
Okay, a question that came up is a fairly obvious one from the audience, that it seems like there's some disjunction between what Ip was arguing and what Lily was arguing. So I think it might be helpful if you guys could either reconcile this or let us know ultimately where you think the disagreement actually lies.
Yeah, I can see why on its face it seems like we're saying opposite things, but I don't think that these two things are inconsistent, because what Yphtach is saying is, if I can paraphrase, is basically party identity is, or affective polarization is driven by this affection for the in-group, this very powerful affection for the in-group. And what we're using to predict violence is affection for the in-group. We're not actually using any feelings. We're predicting feelings toward the out-group using affection for the in-group. So it's, I don't know, I think it's sort of consistent, although I think the one place it's not is the idea that we have these really high levels of animosity on these sort of moral and behavioral levels that I don't think Yp's study was actually looking into. Yp, I'll hand it over.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's with what Lily just said. So I guess there's two things. One is Lily's work. So we're kind of looking at different parts of the distribution here, and I'm looking at the mean, and Lily's looking at a different part of the distribution, but potentially a more problematic portion, because it only takes one guy with a gun. It only takes one person out there to cause serious damage. So I don't think I think you can have both things at once. You can have a really problematic group and also a different attitude among the mean. The other thing, which is kind of to reiterate what Lily said, is that if you think of like a causal chain from in-group love to out-group hate to violence, I would put out-group hate as emerging from in-group love. And so you would see a relationship between out-group hate and violence and destruction. It's just, and it's an important part of the chain. It's a necessary part of the chain. But I think I'm arguing that what comes first is in-group affection.
Okay, next question. I think this is more directed towards, we can start with Sander. One of the questioners asked about the distinction between misinformation, outright fake news, and I guess what you might consider biased reporting by partisan sources, or even reporting by non-biased sources, which are subject to declining trust in the overall media. So perhaps you can explain in terms of your inoculation whether there might actually be side effects of people being, more aware of out and out misinformation, trust more reliable, more mainstream media sources less, by essentially applying the inoculation to sources for which it's not necessary.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, part of people's concern is with blatantly false information identified by third-party fact checkers. I actually think that's not the biggest problem. It's a small percentage of all misinformation. I think the bigger problem is biased media, where specific manipulation techniques are being used to try to deceive people because there's a political agenda, whether that's a persuasive emotional appeal or political language or another technique. And that's kind of where our interventions are focused on helping people calibrate better how reliable something is, rather than trying to think in binaries of what's true and what's false. But an interesting question that pertains to sources, and that's really interesting because there are some research out there that claims that sources don't matter for misinformation, which I'm a bit skeptical of. In some of our experiments, we've seen that if we have liberal versus conservative sources, there are huge partisan effects on misinformation. So pretty much liberals find information coming from conservatives a whole lot less credible, even when it's factual, not just when it's misinformation. And that happens vice versa. So there are very strong effects in credibility evaluations attached to partisan sources. But we haven't, in our game, we try to rule out source compounds by actually using fictional sources so that people don't have prior associations with them. But now we're trying to do some studies where we have specific partisan sources so that we could try to disentangle the relationship better of how partisan bias on sources interacts with the inoculation treatment effect, because it's kind of a complicated question.
And this is a question for Lily, and I'm going to kind of riff a little bit on the actual question that came through, but your focus was primarily on the overall variation and moral disengagement and violent tendencies or whatever, I can't remember the phrase you used. And then also the variation among Republicans related to sexism and racial animus. What are the main sources of variation among Democratic identifiers in terms of their either moral disengagement with Republicans or their propensity to support violence?
Yeah, so I hope you can hear me because I think I might be freezing a little, but for Democrats, most of the variance is explained by the strength of party identification and the strength with which they identify socially with their party. There are some degrees of within the Democratic Party cross-cutting identities. So Democrats who are evangelical are less likely to morally disengage from Republicans. So evangelical and born again Christians, Democrats are less morally disengaging from Republicans because they have that cross-cutting identity. But there aren't very many of those that actually really pop out and explain a lot of variance. So for Democrats, I think it's mostly a partisan thing and somewhat a cross-cutting identity issue.
Okay, I think I've more or less covered the questions that came through. I don't know if any of you three have anything else that you'd like to add here.
I have a quick note, maybe to both Lily's and Nif's data. We just completed a study with Jay van Bevel, actually, where we looked at social media data. So we looked at millions of posts on both Twitter and Facebook from both political elites and as well as news organizations. And then we coded the language for in-group, out-group, as well as moral, emotional. And one of the things we found was that the most consistent predictor of virality was out-group animosity. So there was some in-group love going on, but mostly if you look at angry faces on Facebook, for example, the way that people can express animosity on social media, that was by far the most important predictor of retweets and that kind of engagement. And so that makes me wonder if social media is designed in a way to actually elicit a sort of negative out-group engagement that's detrimental to how people interact online. I'm not sure what you guys think about how your findings kind of translate to social media.
So if you put in a regression model different measures of how you feel about your group and how you feel about the out group, and then you try to predict something, and people do this with voting. If kind of Tajvel is right, and my conception of this as out-group animosity is the mediator between in-group love and out-group hate, if you like replicate, at least I don't know with social media data, but I know with voting data, if you omit out-group animosity, the effect of in-group love skyrockets. So, it's observational data, but it's, I guess, suggestive of a mediation effect.
Terrific. Well, I think we should wrap up there. I want to thank all of our speakers. A very good panel, lots for all of us to think about. And back to Atu.
Thanks, Nolan, and thank you all the panelists. We are on Zoom, but if I could just clap for everyone. Thanks for a great session. Just a quick reminder, the conference will continue tomorrow. We will meet at 12:15 Eastern Time. And the topic of conversation for tomorrow would be the economy. We will talk about the lack of investment and what can be done to boost investment in the US economy, and then also how to make the growth process more equitable so everyone shares equally. Those are the two broad themes tomorrow. So please join us 12:15 tomorrow, and just stay safe, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.